The station smelled like metal and old. Agreements, Varith Crossing had been built by no single species. It sat in the empty space between Keth Dominion territory and the outer edge of human-held systems, a long gray structure that belonged to everyone and therefore to no one. Its corridors were wide enough for 4 different body types. Its air carried a strange mix of filtered oxygen and something floral that the Keth preferred. The lighting changed depending on which section you stood in. It was the kind of place designed for moments that mattered. Today was one of those moments. The Keth delegation arrived first. They always did. Punctuality was a dominant signal. Their culture and Princess Severith Kethora understood dominance the way other beings understood breathing. She arrived with 11 attendants, a ceremonial guard of 8, 2 senior legal advisors, and a robe that cost more than most human colony ships. The robe was deep violet, trimmed with something that moved like liquid even when she stood still. Her skin carried the pale silver-gray tone of the high Keth bloodline. Her eyes were the color of cold amber. She stood at the head of the signing hall and surveyed the room. It was beautiful in the way that things built for politics are beautiful. Long table of pale stone, 2 chairs facing each other, the treaty documents already laid out, thick bound, informal Keth black, sealed at the corners with the Dominion's mark. She had read those documents 3 times. She knew exactly what was inside them. Her senior legal advisor, a thin, careful man named Overath, stood at her shoulder. He said nothing. He didn't need to. They had prepared this for 2 years. The territorial clauses were clear. The sovereignty language was clear. The bonding clause, buried in the 14th appendix, written in an older dialect of Keth legal script, was perfectly, beautifully clear. Once a designated sovereign representative signed, the bonding took legal effect under Dominion law. It was an ancient mechanism, originally designed to bind conquered leaders to the Dominion's ruling line. It had not been used in 400 years. It was still valid, and the humans Overath had assured her would not catch it. Their diplomatic language specialists were good, but the older Keth dialects required decades of study. The clause was 3 paragraphs folded between 2 dense sections about port access rights. Even a careful reader might scan it, see a formality, move on. Severith had allowed herself, privately, to feel pleased about this. Then the human walked in. She had expected a delegation at minimum, a senior ambassador with staff, some display, ceremonial preparation, something that showed the humans understood the weight of what they were signing. One man walked through the door. He was average in every way she had a word for: medium height, brown skin, dark hair going gray at the edges. He wore a plain gray suit with no insignia, no medals, no rank markings. He carried a single flat document case under one arm. He looked like someone who worked in a building and ate lunch at his desk and was perfectly content with both. He found his chair, set his document case down, and looked around the room with the mild, attentive expression of a man who had arrived somewhere and intended to understand it. Severith stared at him. Where, she said, in her translator rendered it in clean standard. Is your delegation? The man looked at her. I'm the delegation, one of her attendants made a small sound. Severith let the silence sit for a moment. Then she said with the kind of precision that made lesser diplomats feel the temperature drop. You come alone, without ceremonial dress, without honor, guard to sign an agreement between your species and the Keth Dominion, yes. Do your people find this appropriate? He seemed to consider the question. Genuinely. My people find it efficient. Her jaw did not move. She was too trained for that. She turned to Overwrath and said something in Keth that the man almost certainly did not speak. Overwrath nodded and signaled for the proceedings to begin. The man sat down across from her and opened his document case. His name, she had been told in the pre-ceremony briefing, was Rael Don, former trade law specialist, Earth Diplomatic Corps. No previous postings of significance. No notable history. He had been described in the human diplomatic roster as mid-level, a background presence. The humans had sent a background presence to sign a treaty with the Keth Dominion. She watched him read. He was slow. Not confused slow. Not struggling slow, deliberate slow. The way someone moves when they have decided that they are going to finish what they are doing regardless of how long it takes or who is watching. He turned each page fully. Sometimes he went back. Her guard shifted. One of her attendants whispered something. Overwrath remained still, but she knew him well enough to see the faint tightening around his eyes. 20 minutes passed. Man read. Severith did not say anything. She would not give him the satisfaction of being asked to hurry. She sat perfectly straight and watched him end. Let the silence be what it was. He reached the 14th appendix. She watched his eyes. They moved across the page. Down, across again. He turned the page. Kept reading. She breathed. He reached the final page, set it down, aligned the stack neatly. Then he looked up at her. She expected hesitation, a question, a request to consult someone. He smiled. It was not a triumphant smile. It was not nervous. It was simply the expression of a man who had arrived at the end of a task and found it consistent with his expectations. He picked up the pen. He signed. Her legal advisors moved forward to witness and seal. The room completed its ceremony. There were no speeches. He hadn't prepared any. She gave hers short, formal, the standard language of Dominion annexation framed as partnership. He listened politely. When it was done, he closed his document. Kay stood, nodded to her once and walked toward the corridor. Behind her, she heard Overwrath lean toward his junior colleague. Did he read the bonding clause? A pause, short, careful. He read everything. Severith stood very still in the center of the room and looked at the door where Rael Don had just walked out. The treaty was signed. The Dominion had what it came for. She told herself the feeling in her chest was satisfaction. She almost believed it. 72 hours later, the flagship was very quiet in the wrong way. The kind of quiet that comes not from calm, but from people moving carefully, speaking in lower voices than usual, looking at documents and then looking away and then looking back. Severith had spent enough time in politics to know what that quiet meant. Something had gone sideways. She found out in the legal chamber, 2 levels below the command deck, where Overwrath was sitting in front of a spread of documents large enough to cover the table and half the floor. He had not slept. She could tell by the way he held his hands, too still. The careful stillness of a man who knew that if he let them move, they would shake. He stood when she entered. Then he told her. she made him explain it twice. The bonding clause, the one buried in the 14th appendix, the one that bound the signing sovereign, representative to the Dominion's ruling line, the one that was supposed to lock humanity into a vassal arrangement while appearing to be a routine legal formality, had worked exactly as designed. That was the problem. Rael Dawn had signed as humanity's designated sovereign representative. The clause activated the moment his signature touched the document. Under Keth ancestor law, the bonding clause defined the signing party as the head of their union. Head of union, bonded to the ruling line, meant one specific thing. Rael Dawn was now, by the Dominion's own ancient legal framework, the designated consort of the Keth sovereign line, which meant Severith. She stood in the legal chamber and let that fact arrange itself in her mind. Overath kept talking. He was explaining the counter-instruments, 17 of them, filed simultaneously with the signing through the Galactic Legal Depository on Verith Crossing, filed before the ink was dry on the treaty. Each one was precise, targeted, and grounded entirely in Keth law, not human law, not galactic treaty law, Keth law. Old Keth law, the same body of legal text that contained the bonding clause. They cited the ancestor accords. They cited the Dominion's own sovereignty statutes. They referenced 7 separate precedents from Keth legal history, 3 of which predated the current triad by 2 centuries. Someone had spent a long time in a library. He knew, Severith said. Overath said nothing. He knew before he walked in. Overath looked at the documents. He read the full treaty in the signing chamber. He read it to confirm it matched what he had already read. She turned away from the table. How long to convene the ancestor court for a bonding dissolution? Overath hesitated. 14 months minimum. The convocation requires. I know what it requires. She stood at the chamber's narrow viewport, outside stars. The edge of Keth space, her space. 14 months during which the bonding stood, during which Rael Dawn had legal standing under her own Dominion's law that she could not simply erase with a statement or a dismissal, during which, if the Keth Dominion attempted to act on any of the territorial provisions of the original treaty, the counter-instruments would trigger a full sovereignty review. The border systems they had already begun preparing to absorb the infrastructure assessments that had been quietly started, all of it suspended, frozen, pending the legal resolution of a clause that her own advisors had designed. She turned from the viewport. Bring him here, she said. Now Overath moved toward the door and then stopped. She saw why. Rael Dawn was already in the corridor outside the legal chamber. He was standing calmly, weight even on both feet, carrying 2 cups of something hot that steamed faintly in the recycled air of the flagship. He was looking at the floor with the patient expression of a man who had been waiting for a reasonable amount of time and was fine with waiting a little longer. He looked up when he heard the door. Severith stared at him through the gap. He held up one of the cups in a small offering gesture. She thought about the treaty, the signing, the smile. She thought about the 14 months ahead on her own flagship with this quiet, gray-suited, thoroughly ordinary-looking man who had walked into her ceremony alone and somehow walked out with everything she had tried to take from him, plus a legal standing in her court that her own ancestors had written into existence. She stepped aside. He walked in, set one cup on the table near her, kept the other, looked at the spread of documents across the floor without any visible surprise. The way someone looks at a mess they fully expected to find. You should have sent more than one person, she said. He picked up his cup. I only needed one. You read the bonding clause? He nodded. Before the ceremony, he nodded again. And you signed anyway? He looked at her then, and the smile came back, that same expression from the signing hall. Patient and certain, and entirely without malice. The clause bound the signing sovereign representative to the ruling line. A pause. It also gave that representative legal standing within the dominion for the duration of the bonding. Standing your advisors designed to be unbreakable. Overath sat down heavily in his chair. I needed standing, Riel said simply, to get a fair treaty. This one wasn't fair. The room was very quiet. So you let the trap close on both of us, Severeth said. He considered this. I let your clause work as written. He set his cup down. The outcome is what the law says it is. I didn't write the law. She wanted to throw something at him. She was aware enough of herself to recognize that the urge came not from rage, but from the specific, infuriating experience of watching a man be correct. 14 months, she said. He nodded as if they had just agreed on a meeting time. 14 months, he said. He picked up his cup again, finished it, and waited for her to tell him where his quarters were. She gave him a room near the service corridors. It was technically a room. It had a bed, a desk, a viewport that looked at the rear engine housing. Instead of open space, the walls were the flat gray of utility sections, not the deep paneled stone of the diplomatic quarters one level up. It was the kind of space assigned to junior maintenance staff. Riel moved in without comment, made his bed, set up his document case on the desk, asked through the ship's communication system whether there was a common area with access to warm beverages. There was. He began appearing there each morning. Severeth found out through her attendants, who found out from the kitchen staff, who found out because the human kept asking polite questions about what the different drinks were and whether he could try them, and was always very grateful and never made a mess. She told herself this was not her problem. She issued the first formal exclusion 2 weeks in. A court function, a gathering of senior Keth military advisors and Dominion nobility, the kind of event that required invitation, rank, and standing. She had her chamberlain prepare the guest list and ensure Riel Don's name did not appear on it. He showed up anyway, not loudly, not in a way that created a scene. He simply appeared at the entrance, presented a copy of the Ancestor Accord bonding statutes to the door attendant, page 47, paragraph 3, which stated clearly that the bonded consort held right of presence at all formal Dominion gatherings, and walked in. He stood near the back wall, held a drink he barely touched, spoke when spoken to, and left when it was over. No one knew how to remove him, because under Keth law they couldn't. Severeth watched him from across the room for 2 hours and said nothing. She issued a public statement the following week. Her communications office drafted it carefully. It described the bonding as an administrative error under legal review, called Riel Don's presence on the flagship a temporary procedural circumstance, and made clear that the Princess viewed the matter as an inconvenience being resolved through appropriate channels. Human diplomatic channels received the statement. Riel received a copy. He read it, filed it in his document case, did not respond. She had him moved to a smaller room. He moved without complaint, asked if there was a closer route to the common area. 3 weeks later, Severeth walked past the common area and heard from inside the sound of low conversation and something that might have been laughter. She stopped, looked through the open doorway. Riel was sitting at a table with 2 of her junior crew members. They were looking at something on a flat screen, some kind of visual, it appeared, of a place on Earth, green hills and low buildings. One of the crew members was asking a question. Riel was answering it, calm, unhurried, the same tone he used for everything. She walked on. She confronted him privately that evening in the corridor outside the legal chamber, where Overath still spent most of his time. She had decided on the approach. Carefully, direct, no ceremony. Let him know the precise terms of what she thought of him. You are an embarrassment to my station, she said. Every person on the ship knows why you are here. They know what was done. They know what you did in response. And they see a man in a gray suit eating the common area and making friends with my crew, and it makes the entire situation, it makes me. She stopped. Riel waited. He always waited. She had noticed. He never filled the silence she left with something convenient. You are nothing in Keth's eyes, she said. You should understand that. He looked at her. You called me nothing at the signing ceremony too. A pause. You still signed. She felt something move through her that was not quite anger but lived next door to it, the same feeling as being shown a mirror at an unflattering angle, not because the mirror was cruel, but because it was accurate. She wanted to dismiss him, walk away, use the silence as the power move it usually was. Instead, she heard herself ask, "What do you want?" She did not plan to ask it. The question arrived before she could weigh it. Riel looked at her, and for a moment the patient, mild expression and GT clear his throat, and GT shifted into something more direct. Not hard, not threatening, just honest, like a window that had been lightly fogged and was now briefly clear. A fair treaty, he said. We'll get there. She said nothing. Original one wasn't fair, he continued. Your advisors built a structure designed to give your dominion control of human border systems while making it appear like a mutual partnership. Our colonies on 3 of those systems have been there for 60 years. The people, they were born there. He picked up the cup he was carrying. He always seemed to be carrying something warm. She had noticed and looked at it briefly. I'm not angry about the clause. It was a smart play. But the treaty underneath it needed to be fixed. That's what I'm here to do. You could have simply refused to sign, and then what? Another 2 years of negotiation with the same advisors designing the same traps. He shook his head. This way I have standing time access. He glanced toward the legal chamber door, and Overath has been very generous about sharing his references. Severeth stared at him. Overath is working with you. Overath is a good lawyer, Riel said. He doesn't like the idea of the ancestor court reviewing his work any more than your Dominion likes the current situation. He would prefer this resolved correctly. So would I. She stood in the corridor. For a long moment, the ship moved. Beneath her feet, somewhere deep in the hull, something hummed steadily. You are the strangest man I have ever encountered, she said. He seemed to consider this genuinely. I've been told. He nodded once that same small, even nod and walked toward the common area. She stood in the corridor alone and did not follow him, and did not understand why some part of her wanted to. The ancestor court convened on the 14th month as scheduled. The chamber was old, older than the current triad, older than most of the treaties it had been built to adjudicate. It sat inside the Dominion seat of governance, a vast stone structure on the Keth homeworld, its walls carved with the names of every legal decision it had ever produced. Carvings went very deep. The chamber was very full of names. 11 elder justices sat at the curved bench at the room's far end. They wore the gray and violet of ancestor service, and they had been pulled from retirement, from other postings, from the careful distance most Keth legal minds preferred to keep from active political situations. They had been briefed. They had read the documents. They looked as a group like people who had expected a simple morning and were beginning to understand it would not be. The Keth side presented first. Overrath led the argument, which was precise and well constructed, and made the case that the bonding clause had been activated under conditions that did not reflect the original intent of the ancestor accords. The clause was designed for situations of conquest and territorial absorption. Riel Don was not a conquered sovereign, he was a diplomatic representative. The distinction was meaningful. The 11 justices listened, made notes, asked questions. Then it was Riel's turn. He stood in the center of the chamber floor alone, no legal team. He had declined the option of assistance twice, both times politely, both times without explaining why. He had a single document folder, which he set on the floor beside his feet and did not open. For the first 20 minutes, he did not argue against the voiding. That was the thing that shifted the temperature in the room. He stood up, nodded to the bench, and said he wanted to make sure the court had complete information before it voted. That was all. Not a challenge, not a counter-argument, an offer of information. He walked them through the dissolution clause within the ancestor accords, specifically the provisions governing what happened when a bonding was voided by the Dominion side party rather than mutual agreement. Under Keth law, dissolution initiated unilaterally by the Dominion triggered a sovereignty reset on all territorial provisions linked to the original signing event. Everything that had been agreed in the original treaty, port access, trade corridors, and most critically, the border system provisions that the Keth had already begun implementing, would revert to pre-agreement status pending a full review by the Galactic Legal Depository, which handled disputes of this nature at a pace that could generously be described as unhurried. The border systems the Dominion had been quietly operating for 14 months would need to be vacated. The infrastructure already built on 2 of those systems, substantial, expensive 14 months of Dominion resources, would be in legal limbo. Riel did not say this as a threat. He said it the way a person reads weather data. Here is the information. Here is what the law says follows from it. He opened his document folder and submitted each relevant statute, individually with page numbers to the court clerk. He cited 7 Keth precedents. 3 of them were older than anyone in the room, the eldest of the 11 justices, a woman so old her silver-gray skin had gone nearly white, who had not moved visibly since the proceedings began, leaned slightly forward. "You prepared this," she said. It was not a question. "Yes," Riel said. Before the original signing, a pause. "I needed to understand the full legal landscape before I agreed to anything." The chamber was quiet. Severith sat at the head table to the right of the bench. She had been there for 4 hours. She had watched Overath present the Dominion's case with precision and genuine skill, had watched the justices respond with the careful attention of people taking a matter seriously, had told herself this would be over today, and had believed it. Now she watched Riel stand in the center of the floor, completely still, completely alone, while 11 of the most senior legal minds in the Dominion processed the documents he had just submitted. She thought about the signing hall, the gray suit, the single document case. She thought about him reading slowly every page. She thought about 14 months of a man who absorbed dismissal and exclusion and small indignities, and came back each morning to the common area and asked politely about the drinks and found out which routes led where, and said almost nothing about any of it. She thought he was never waiting to win. He was waiting for them to be ready to do it correctly. The eldest justice looked up from the documents. "The legal position you have described," she said to Riel, "is accurate. The dissolution provisions are as you have cited them." A pause. "This places the court in a complicated position, I understand," Riel said. "You have not argued against the voiding of the bonding itself, no. You have only argued that the court should understand the full consequence of how it voids it." "Yes." The eldest justice was quiet for a moment. Then she looked at Severith. "Hi, daughter." The old formal address, used only in the ancestor court. "The court will ask you directly, as the law requires. The bonding is yours to dissolve or maintain, independent of what this court rules on the treaty provisions. Those are separate questions under the accords." She folded her hands. "What is your wish regarding the bonding itself?" The chamber went still. 11 justices. Overath staring at the table. The clerks. Frozen. Riel in the center of the floor looking at her. He did not smile. He did not look hopeful or calculating or afraid. He looked at her the way he looked at everything, with patient full attention, as if whatever she said next was worth hearing. Completely. 14 months, 1,000 small moments she had not named, a man who wanted nothing except what was fair and had walked into a trap so he could be there when the fair thing happened. Severith looked at him for a long time. The silence stretched. The justices waited. She did not answer, not yet. Verith Crossing smelled the same, metal and old agreements in that faint floral note the Keth brought with them wherever they went. The lighting shifted by section. The corridors were wide enough for 4 different body types. Nothing about it had changed. Everything else had. The signing hall had been prepared again. Same pale stone table, same 2 chairs. Same arrangement of neutral formality that the station did so well, but this time there were documents on both sides of the table, and both sets had been reviewed by both legal teams, and both legal teams had, after 11 months of negotiation, concluded that the language was fair, not favorable to one side. Fair, there was a difference, and everyone in the room understood it. Severith arrived first again. Old habit. She stood at the head of the room in a robe that was still formal, but not the same one she had worn before. This one was deep blue, not violet, a color that in Keth tradition indicated a proceeding entered voluntarily, rather than by rank. Her attendants noticed. They said nothing. Some things communicated themselves. Without requiring words, Overath stood at her shoulder. He looked better than he had in over a year. The careful stillness was gone from his hands. He had spent 11 months in the negotiation rooms doing the work he was actually built for, honest legal architecture, and it showed in the way he carried himself, like a man who had put down something heavy and was still remembering what it felt like to stand straight. The human delegation arrived. 3 people this time, 2 legal specialists who had flown in from Earth, young and serious, and carrying far too much documentation. They arranged themselves at the table and began cross-checking document copies with the focused energy of people who had been told to be thorough and had taken the instruction personally. Riel came in. Behind them, same gray suit. She did not know if it was the same one, or simply the same kind. She had stopped finding it strange months ago. It was just what he wore. It suited him. The way water suits a stone, not because it was chosen, but because it was simply correct. He looked around the room, the same mild, attentive survey he had done the first time his eyes found her. He nodded, small even. She nodded back. The ceremony began. The senior Keth legal officer read the terms aloud in both versions, in both languages, as protocol required. The human legal specialists followed along on their copies, checking. The room was quiet in the good way this time, the way that comes from people paying attention because the thing happening matters and they want to be present for it. When the reading was finished, the officer set the documents on the table. Severith picked up the pen. She read the document first, all of it. She had read it 14 times in the previous weeks, knew every paragraph, but she read it again now because this moment deserved that, because doing a thing correctly meant doing it fully, not just doing it fast. She reached the end. She signed. She slid the document across the table to Riel. He picked it up. He read it, every page, slowly, with the same deliberate patience he had applied to the first one 16 months ago, turning each page fully, occasionally going back while the room and everyone in it waited, and no one said anything about the waiting because everyone present had figured out at some point in the past year that this was simply how Rael Don did things, and there was nothing to be done about it. He reached the last page. He looked up. The smile came back. She knew it now. She had spent 14 months watching it in different situations, at legal proceedings, in corridor conversations, in the common area over a cup of something warm, and she understood its grammar. It was not a smile of victory. It had never been that. It was not condescension, not performance, not the particular satisfaction of a person who had beaten someone else at something. It was the expression of a man who had looked at a situation, decided what it needed to become, and committed to that outcome completely and without reservation. Smile was what lived on the other side. Of a decision like that, not triumph. Something steadier, patience wearing. The shape of a smile he signed. The room completed the rest of its ceremony. Documents sealed, witnesses recorded. Copies distributed, the human legal. Specialists repacked their considerable documentation with visible relief. Overath shook hands with his counterparts, which in Keth tradition meant something significant and in human tradition meant something slightly different, but the meaning behind it was the same. The delegations began to disperse. Severeth stood at the table. For a moment, she was not delaying deliberately. She was simply pausing, letting the room be what it was for one more moment. Before it became something past. Rail was capping his pen. She said it quietly, low enough that it did not carry across the room. You knew from the beginning. He set the pen down, considered the table, then looked at her. I hoped, he said. There's a difference. She looked at him. What did you hope for specifically? He was quiet for a moment. Outside the viewport, the station lights crossed the slow, permanent dark, that there was someone on the other side of the table worth getting this right for. He said, a treaty without that is just paper. It holds until someone decides it doesn't. He picked up the pen again, turned it once in his fingers. You signed first today. You didn't have to. The protocol didn't require it. I know. That was the right thing to do. He set the pen down. I noticed. She stood with that for a moment. Somewhere behind her, one of her attendants was waiting. The flagship was waiting. The Dominion was waiting for the announcement, for the transition briefings, for the formal start of an agreement that would hold. Because it had been built on honest ground, everything was waiting. She was not quite ready to move yet. The bonding dissolution completes at the end of this month, she said. Yes, formally you no longer have standing in my court. No. She looked at him. He looked back. The patience in him was a steady, unhurried thing like deep water. New treaty provides for a permanent human diplomatic presence within Dominion space, she said. A senior representative, considerable access. A pause. I expect whoever they send to be someone I can work with. Rail said nothing. Someone who reads documents fully, she added. He almost smiled. Not quite, just the edge of it. She picked up her copy of the treaty, tucked it under her arm, and walked toward the door. She did not look back. She did not need to. She already knew his expression. She had memorized it without meaning to. Across 14 months of a man who walked into a trap to build something fair on the other side of it, patience wearing the shape of a smile. She carried that with her out of the room, into the corridor, toward everything that came next. Behind her, the signing hall went quiet. The pale stone table sat empty. The documents were already on their way home.